Here. Sustenance.
I'll eat it later. Thanks for the help.
You will be welcome.
Gary was at one point a seemingly regular Vortigaunt. He would unfortunately be captured by the Combine, and while under their control, be subject to one or more procedures. This would leave him with several Combine technologies embedded in his body and being severed from the Vortessence. Gary would eventually escape their clutches and find a utility tunnel in a canal within the quarantine zone of City 17. This would become his home. Outside in the canal itself, he would paint a vast mural depicting events spanning a wide range of time, including the Combine invasion of the Vortigaunt homeworld, the enslavement of the Vortigaunts by the Nihilants, the Black Mesa incident, and much more. This art and artistry would extend to the rest of his home with depictions of several different topics, including everything from Hound Eyes to the G-Man. His decorative sense didn't stop there. He would seemingly create an elaborate entrance for his home using rusted sheet metal, complete with a doorbell. Inside, he would hang picture frames, put down rugs, and ironically seemed to hang Combine anti-Vortigaunt posters. He also has a denim jacket in his possession. Finally, he appeared to set down messages using Vortigaunt energy and scrap cardboard outside in the canal. At some point, after Gary had gathered, set up, and created these things, Alyx Vance would stumble upon his messages, creations, and himself at his home. While he would help her proceed with her initial quest of saving her father from the Combine, he would bring to her attention something else: the other captured Vortigaunts in the quarantine zone.
Like the Eli man. The Alyx man will free them.
He'd promise to help her and suggest that she follow the Northern Star for guidance.
I will help the Alyx Vance. Look to the Northern Star.
Why?
For guidance.
Okay, thanks.
Later, Alyx would crash a razor train destined for Nova Prospekt that was carrying Eli. While he was free, he would end up in a precarious situation. Gary would make good on his promise and rescue him, though. Gary would also create a path forward for Alyx to follow as the plan changed to get to the vault. You'd last be seen helping Eli get away from the crash site.
I love you too.
Alyx would eventually end up following Gary's advice, finding the Northern Star Hotel and triggering a series of events that would lead to the destruction of the vault. Gary is seen twice in-game, his first appearance being at his home on A2 Hideout in the chapter The Quarantine Zone, and then once again in A2 Train Yard in the chapter Is or Will Be. Although never named in-game, the name Gary is used in several not-working scripts in the Vortigaunt's home, mostly in reference to a missing entity. This isn't the only place the name is used. It is used in an animation file unique to his model called Gary Scratch Arm, where he scratches at the Combine tech embedded in his arm. The aforementioned model is called Vortigaunt Tunnels, and is exclusively used by him. The other Vortigaunt seen later is referred to as Uncombined Vortigaunt. Here's some concept art of his model. As well, some concept art was generated for his home in the canals. Meeting Gary was supposed to go very differently. Work began on the sequence at least 2 years prior to release, with the test sequence in place by October 15th, 2018. In this test version, Gary was injured and needed the player to squeeze nectar from headcrab hearts into his mouth in order to help him. The sequence used in the retail game was in place sometime in 2019, as we can see from the choreographed scene entities in Hammer, as well as animations attached to Gary's model. The October 2018 sequence was the first animation test done by Karen Prell. She provides additional insight in the developer commentary as to how and why the sequence evolved between these 2 points. The 2018 footage and the extra text-based commentary come from the final hours of Half-Life Alyx.
The fundamental challenge of any choreographed dramatic scene like this one is making sure that we entertain the player without undermining the delivery of critical gameplay information. In this case, the player needed to leave this scene with the knowledge that the Vortigaunts have been imprisoned and that the player should seek the Northern Star. This particular scene went through many different variations during development, from a cooking scene with an extremely traumatized Vortigaunt to this humorous version. We even experimented with an interaction where the player was required to squeeze the nectar of several headcrab hearts into the Vortigaunt's mouth to revive him. While this was a memorable and novel VR interaction that ensured the player was engaged with the scene, the interactivity on the player's part often resulted in playtesters remembering the actions they took, but not the critical gameplay information. Eventually, we ended up with this more humorous scene, which struck an effective balance between entertainment and goal delivery. Importantly, we also distributed the scene across 2 separate rooms, breaking the information delivery into 2 steps. The first room where the player meets and learns about the state of the Vortigaunt, and the second room where the player is given their new goal. Separating these physically into rooms seemed to help players more reliably retain the critical information delivered in the second room. While this scene did undergo a lot of changes, one story beat remained virtually unchanged from the very first roughed-in version. The moment the Vortigaunt tosses a headcrab carcass down to the player and yells, "Sustenance!" Right from the start, this moment always got a great reaction from playtesters and remained all the way to the final product.
She also added that the repetitive actions of squeezing the hearts affected the overall energy of the scene. While the interaction with Gary himself was reduced, other interactive elements were brought into the scene, and a little bit of this original 2018 test remains in the game despite all the changes, as noted by Matthew Scott in the developer commentary.
For as long as we've been making choreographed scenes like this one, we've found that there are 2 types of players. Those who become engrossed with the characters, and those who tinker with everything around them, paying little attention to the scene's action. To make these environments entertaining for the tinkerers, we usually add objects for them to find and play with. Since this scene is split into 2 rooms, we were able to add a large number of interactions to this first room, for players to discover after the Vortigaunt has moved to the second room. Some interactive objects are pure physically driven toys, like the dangling headcrab corpses and the hanging pans. Others are animations triggered by the player's actions, like the way the caged headcrabs react to the player approaching or shooting them. One type of object on the table is a squeezable headcrab heart, which is a remnant from an older version of this scene where the player would revive a wounded Vortigaunt by squeezing nectar from these hearts. While that scene didn't work out, we found the experience too compelling and, well, too gross to completely cut from the game.
Gary's mural also went through some iteration per Claire Hummel.
There are 2 layers to the markings on the walls in this area. The square and dot patterns, that are the functional elements of the environmental puzzle, and the mural representing the Vortigaunt's interpretation of the events of the Half-Life saga. For the first few years of development, this area only contained the dot patterns supporting the perspective puzzle, but as we fleshed out the rest of the level, we found that playtesters responded especially positively to the Vortigaunt's wall markings leading up to the hideout. It was at this point that we realized that this area could serve as a canvas for our Vortigaunt's artistic magnum opus. To do this, we organized the dot patterns into a sort of swirling star field behind the Vortigaunt's art. The imagery itself, which was inspired by petroglyphs and other traditional rock art, portrays many significant events from the Combine invasion, painted hurriedly by the injured Vortigaunt, almost as if he was trying to capture what fleeting memories he still had of the Vortessence from which he had been severed. The fact that Vortigaunts have a complicated relationship with time gave us a lot of leeway in terms of drawing this as a strict, linear timeline. For example, you may notice that the Vortigaunt uses contemporary Combine troops as shorthand for Combine invasions from the past, or that the timeline is just generally hazy. A little from the past, a little from the present, and a little looking forward to the future events of Half-Life 2.
Gary also wouldn't have just painted the mural and the other pictures, he would have also written messages in English. Just outside the playable space are several overlays that appear to have been meant for a wall somewhere in the map. This is the full and unobstructed texture sheet of those messages. The Eli rescue scene at the train crash site didn't originally include Gary, as Greg Coomer mentions.
For the rescue of Eli, we wanted to create a tense, just out of reach moment where the player physically saves him. But for the rest of the story to work, Alex and Eli had to take different paths at the end of the scene. We tried a few different approaches, including a version where Eli was hanging from a ledge just in front of the player, and the player could reach down to attempt to grab Eli's hand to pull him up. In practice, however, players' hands would collide with the real-world floor. Not only did this make it impossible to reach Eli, it took players out of the moment, wrecking the emotion of the scene. Since Eli and Alex had to take different paths, we tried an approach where Alex rescued Eli, but he was injured and couldn't proceed. Unfortunately, many players would stick around, not wanting to abandon him. Eventually, we arrived at the solution that shipped in the final product. Separating Eli from the player with the Vortigaunt's rescue made for a much more meaningful return and fulfillment of the Vortigaunt's promise to help Alex. The datapod that Eli found was an addition that not only let us integrate Eli back into the story later, but also gave him something to do, so there was a much stronger reason why he would not accompany the player on their journey going forward.
Finally, Gary's voice was to appear at some point either in the vault just prior to or during the G-Man scene, as a ghostly rendition of his "I love you too" line is included in a special Do Not Ship folder for the endgame.
I love you